Okay, so what I'm going to do tonight is mainly to introduce the installation, which will be opened in a few minutes upstairs, which is called Adorno's Grey, and then also I wanted to show you a few clips from other works, other recent works of mine. Adorno's Grey is quite an unusual installation, I think, in my work, first of all because it's black and white. I've never done anything in black and white before, but also because it's a bit more serious and more quiet. I think I'm the only one who really thinks it's a comedy, but I don't sincerely think so. What is it about? Adorno's Grey is first of all a single screen video installation, which is installed in a very particular way, and you're going to be able to see this in a minute, so I will not go in detail with that. But what is it about? What does it do? It tries to connect two specific, let's say, occurrences from the life of Theodor W. Adorno. First of all, a sort of trivia from his life, which has become quite famous, or one might say infamous even, which is the so-called breast attack, which happened in the, let's say, late stages of the 68 student protests in Frankfurt in 1969. Adorno was allowed to hold an introduction to dialectical thinking, and he had had a lot of, let's say, disputes with students already during the course of protests. And then three girls walked up to him before he was able to start his lecture and started to undress and dance around him. And apparently Adorno was quite shocked. And he took up his briefcase and walked, back out of the room. And he never returned because he died a few months later. This happened to be his last lecture. This is a very peculiar incident in Germany because the lecture hall was packed. There must have been literally hundreds of people in there. Yet up to this day, people are very, very reluctant to talk about this incident because it seems as if, on this day something went somehow wrong and no one is really able to really articulate what it was or how it happened. So I was really, in a way, lucky to find a known documentary filmmaker who really wanted to tell this story. But the angle through which, the perspective through which I'm addressing this event, which cannot in the end be really clarified, nobody knows what really happened and why in this day, is another unconfirmed detail from Adorno's life, which is the fact that apparently he had his lecture hall painted in grey. And so this is basically an urban legend. No one really knows whether that ever really took place or not, even though many people say so. And I always ask myself, why grey? Why would anyone paint a lecture hall in grey? It's not an academic tradition as far as I'm aware of. So actually I found out that it's not an academic tradition, it's a painterly tradition. Some painters, for example, Matisse, painted their studio in grey in order to have colors appear neutral. This is how Matisse painted his studio actually. But in fact it seems to have been grey. And this is also echoed in contemporary, let's say, commodity items for coloring painters' studios. So, but Adorno seems to have painted the lecture hall in grey in order to focus people's thoughts on the things he was saying. And again, this seemed pretty remarkable to me, because the thing that came to my mind was that during this period, Gerhard Richter was painting grey grey monochromes in the late 60s, early 70s, which he called constellations. And Gerhard Richter, of course, continued to paint grey monochromes also later on, when he was dealing actually with the aftermath of the student protests, namely the militants that went underground and what happened to them in jail in Stammheim after they were, captured and imprisoned, and actually ended up killing themselves in 1977. And the series of paintings he made at this point in time were equally great paintings, but they weren't really monochromes. There was something in between photographies and monochromes. They were basically photographs which came unfocused. They were unfocused. I mean, in my view. I'm not an artist. They look like unfocused photographs to me. And so there was this tension for me between the grey monochromes of the 70s and the unfocused photographs of 20 years later. And I came to think that actually, probably, maybe, the grey wall that Adorno had painted or not, may have been the only witness of the so-called rest attack, the only truthful witness, so to say, because no one else wanted to say anything about it. Maybe the grey wall was, so to speak, the unfocused documentary imprint of this event. So, this is the reason why this is the lecture hall. Actually, this is what it looks like today. And the interesting thing is that there are grey layers on the wall all over. It seems to have painted in grey like at least a dozen times, And I mean, I tried to ask people who had been working there for a long time, but no one actually really knew what was going on with the grey. It's very obvious that, people have for decades painted layers of grey over grey over grey. So I set up a sort of not even a thought experiment, like a laboratory experiment really, asking two conservators of historical paintings to set out to find the one and only unique Adorno grey layer, which they faithfully attempted to do. And I'm not going to tell you what happened. Please have a look at the video upstairs in a minute. So basically the film consists of a sort of quest for this mythical layer of grey in order to maybe, refocus this monochrome layer of wall paint to see what actually happened. I mean, this was the plan, and in documentary plans are only a starting point, and then things get out of control usually. There's a kind of, this is not in the film, right? None of this, of course, is in the film. I'm just showing you supporting materials and things that were important for me in the research process and in the process of scripting the work. There is an anecdote which I still don't understand, and most people never really understand, but nevertheless I will tell it to you, because the three girls that undertook that so-called rest attack have preferred to remain anonymous until I think it was like 3-4 years ago, and only one of them stepped forward and gave her point of view on these events. And interestingly, this person, what we call Hannah Weitemeyer, became a curator of contemporary art later. And she spent specialized in monochromes, namely Eve Klein monochromes. This is a quote from one of her texts about Eve Klein. Well, so this is about misunderstandings of Eve Klein's monochrome work. And the sort of irony in that is that Eve Klein had an equally contested death, namely when a film about one of his works was premiered at the Film Festival of Cannes. And this film was called Mondo Cane. It was a collection of unbelievable, shocking, and exaggerated events collected randomly from all over the place. And for one reason or another, the filmmakers had included a performance of Eve Klein, women printing their bodies tinted in blue colors on shrouds. And the filmmakers of Mondo Cane, Eve Klein was very serious about that. He had written a score, to be performed with the performance, and the filmmakers of Mondo Cane had exchanged this for some sort of softball soundtrack. It was really terrible. Anyhow, poor Eve Klein had a heart attack the same evening of the premiere, and he unfortunately ended up dying half a year later from this experience. This is something I found a few months ago, which maybe draws a completely different line into the history of, taking your clothes off in order to protest, and this is a protest action by Ukrainian women who staged a protest during German electronic equipment fair, during which Vladimir Putin was also present. And as you can see, he was very impressed, but let's say he had the opposite reaction to Adorno, if you like. So in that sense, maybe that strand of protest has come to an impasse or dead end. And in the installation itself, you will see that I also compiled timelines, of different events to sort of contextualize this Adorno constellation, if you want. And the timeline of nude protests is one of them. Well, I mean, this is basically what I have to say in relation to Adorno's grave. Maybe to contextualize it with some of my other work. I made a series, quite a series now, of works which deal with abstraction, and not abstraction as such, because I don't know anything about abstraction, but abstraction in relation to the documentary record, the documentary image, because it occurred to me at a certain point that abstraction had become the most truthful documentary picture there was at a certain point in time. And this occurred to me in 2003 when I was watching a live CNN report from the US invasion into Iraq, and the journalist was live broadcasting the invasion by sticking a cell phone camera out the window of a moving car as they were riding into the country. And he was completely exhilarated, He said, "You've never seen any footage like that before," which was true, because that technology had never been tested, and it was also true because one couldn't basically see anything because the broadcast was so pixelated. At that time there was no bandwidth, to support any such broadcast, so it looked basically like military camouflage pixels slowly, moving over the screen. And it occurred to me that basically, probably since the times of, say, camcorder revolution, or maybe to give it a more precise date, the Rodney King incident, paradoxically, the most truthful and urgent and authentic seeming documentary footage was footage that was essentially so blurred that it really was close to abstraction, if not completely abstracted. So this relation between documentary and abstraction has fascinated me ever since, and of course it keeps changing. It keeps changing in relation to the development of technology. This is a tiny work I did in order to underline some of the points I have been making. It's called Strikes, it's 21 seconds. Yeah. This is basically all I have to say in relation to television. Because I think that creating this kind of abstract image is the best thing you can get from a flat screen. But apart from that, I think in this tiny work, it was also important for me to show basically the material carrier of digital or analog video images. And in this case, I was really fascinated with how the matrix itself looked like after being destroyed. It seemed to me that the destroyed matrix was much more interesting and also appealing as an image than functional matrix, if you wish. But also, this was highlighting the fact that, so to speak, the condition for making any video image visible, the matrix itself, was usually completely invisible. I mean, we usually don't see matrices. We don't know what they look like, we don't know how they are being made, the materials they consist of, and so on and so on. And to think through the material carrier of images. This is one point which I think is also highlighted in the installation upstairs, even though this does not relate to digital imagery so much. This has been a very consistent concern of my work to really insist that even though most people think that digital images are somehow immaterial, like ideas, Platonic ideas, they require this huge material assemblage, if you wish, of servers, of televisions, of cables, of raw materials, that are being mined somewhere. So this material level of the digital representation, if you like, is something very important. Let me show you a brief clip from a work of mine which is called In Free Fall. Let's maybe just have a look at 5 or so minutes, which tries to make this point by looking at the use and recycling of aluminum as a carrier, not a carrier, but as a reflexive layer on DVDs, because you needed aluminum in order to produce DVDs, and it's really paradoxical. I made this work, I think, in 2010, meaning 3 years ago, and now DVD is almost a dead medium, right? So it's moving very fast. But this work is based on the idea that planes that get withdrawn from circulation because of financial crisis, because of crash, that these end up being recycled by various means to end up as DVDs. And so in this work, I was portraying an airplane graveyard in California where this process of transformation and recycling took place, and because of its proximity to Hollywood, there was of course another method of recycling airplanes, which was to simply blow them up for a blockbuster movie, and then collect the parts, and then ship the parts up to China, where in my imagination they would be melted down, applied, as a reflexive layer to a DVD, and then the pirated version of the film, in which the plane was blown up in the first place, would be printed on the DVD, so that actually the film in which the plane was destroyed was printed on the debris, of the plane itself, on the render. There was this Möbius strip-like circle of circulation of materials and images, which I found really fascinating. Let me just show you a few minutes.
Good morning, Kevin. I just wanted to ask you, who shot the images we see right now?
I shot. I thought by I עבור חברת TWA, ונראה זה הודפס עבור חיל האוויר הישראלי, ונראה זה הודפס עבור operation from flight attendants.
Entwirft der sowjetische Schriftsteller Sergei Tretjakov die Biografie des Objekts. Ein Objekt erzählt uns von den Menschen, die es herstellen und verwenden. Seine Biografie stellt einen Querschnitt der sozialen Verhältnisse dar. Die Biografie des Objekts umfasst auch seine Zerstörung.
מטוס RX-7 היה מטוס בואינג 707. בסופו של דבר הוא סיים את חייו כשפוצצו אותו עבור צילומי הסרט ספיד. אבל לפני זה הוא טס עבור חיל האוויר הישראלי.
Yeah, the original Speed, we took a 707 and we fixed it up and cut holes in the wings so that when it blew up, it would really blow up. And that airplane had 10 drums in it filled with gasoline and sand and dynamite. So when it blew a hole right in the top, and then this huge ball of flame came out of that thing.
Jede Biografie hat auch einen Anfang. (1929) beschreibt Tretjakov das Objekt auf dem Fließband. 1929 ist auch das Jahr mit den meisten Flugzeugabstürzen der Geschichte. (1929) stürzen die Kurse an der New Yorker Börse ab. 1929 dreht Howard Hughes auf den Film Hells Angels, in dem es um Flieger im Ersten Weltkrieg geht. Hughes heuert echte Kampfpiloten an. Aber auch diese weigern sich, eine der Szenen zu fliegen, weil sie für zu gefährlich halten. Hughes fliegt sie selbst und stürzt ab. Er liegt 4 Tage im Koma. Danach dreht er den Film fertig. Mit diesem Film wurde Howard Hughes als Regisseur bekannt. 10 Jahre später kaufte er die Fluggesellschaft TWA.
I knew of Howard Hughes, and Hughes owned TWA, and when I actually joined TWA, he still owned it.
חברת יוז הסבירה במקור את 4XJYI עבור חברת TWA ב-1956. יש עוד חלק מהמטוסים שהזמין יוז היו שותפים לאותו הגורל בערך משהו כמו 20 שנה. מתישהו בשנות ה-70 נמכרה חבורה של מטוסי בואינג 707 לישראל. שם הוסטו המטוסים לשימוש של חיל האוויר.
כשמדברים על תקיפה באיראן לא מיד המחשבה על מטוסי קרב כמו F-15. אבל שום מטוס קרב לא ידע להגיע לאיראן בלי עזרתם של המטוסים האלה, RNE, בואינג 707, המילה האחרונה בתעופה האזרחית בשנות ה-60 של המאה הקודמת.
זה המטוס הכי צעיר בליין בין 13 שנים. ילד. המבוגר בן 50, חגג יובל השנה.
קצת קורטאות.
אפילו חלילה.
מטוס 4XJYI הוא הוסק לשימוש כמטוס תובלה, וניתן לו גם שם כינוי ראם. מטוס אחר מאותה הקבוצה הוסב למרכז בקרה אלקטרוני, וניתן לו שם הבקרה 4XJYD. אותו המטוס גם השתתף במבצע אנטבה ב-1976, שבו מטוס אייר פרנס נחטף על ידי פעילים מיליטנטים גרמנים ופלסטינים עם קשרים לחזות העממית לשחרור פלסטין, או ה-PFLP.
Don't anyone speak! Don't move! This is a live grenade. The pin is out. If anyone tries anything, if anyone touches me, I'm only to drop it, and I won't hesitate to do it.
נעשו 3 סרטים בעקבות המבצע.
Exactly what I say.
Okay. Attention, everyone. Attention.
May I have your attention, please?
We represent the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Of the Che Guevara.
The Azad Brigade. We're now in complete control of this flight.
This plane is now under our control.
Is it HD?
I mean, this is a small part of the history of that plane before it is blown up for a Hollywood blockbuster movie and then recycled to become a DVD, amongst other things. Now, do I have 5 more minutes? Okay. Briefly introduce the last work, which again deals with questions of abstraction. This is the so-called US Air Force Resolving Power Test Target, which is essentially a resolution scale in order to test film stock for aerial photography. And the fascinating thing for me was that these power test targets, these resolution scales, were actually built in 3D in the California desert in order to test aerial photography and to see which sort of film stock to use and so on and so on. So again, this is, let's say, an abstract pattern which is underlying or which forms the base of visibility or did form the base of visibility. This is an analog pattern which has been decommissioned since, but which has formed the base for things to become visible for a long time and within, of course, a certain paradigm which could be called the military industrial entertainment paradigm, if you like. And this pattern became the base for a sort of instruction film, a manual on how to become invisible in a world in which images are basically proliferating. This short video is called How Not to Be Seen, a fucking didactic educational MOV file. And it gives instructions on how to become invisible in a world which is essentially made of images. This is the instruction which states that in order to become invisible, you have to take a photograph. So this is basically a manual on how to merge, how to camouflage into a world in which the debris of not only digital but also analog imagery is basically crowding our environments. And if we want to become invisible, we have to post-produce ourselves by all digital and analog means available in order to become an image so as not to be seen, so as to camouflage into the background. Can I show 5 minutes? Okay, and then I'll stop. We don't.
Lesson 1. There are 4 ways to make something invisible for a camera. To hide. To remove. To go off screen. To disappear. This is a resolution target. It measures the visibility of a picture. This is a resolution target. It measures the resolution of the world as a picture. Resolution determines visibility. Whatever is not captured by resolution is invisible. How not to be seen. Lesson 2. There are 7 ways of making something invisible in plain sight. Pretend you are not there. Hide in plain sight. To scroll. To wipe. To erase. To shrink. To take a picture.
Today, most important things want to remain invisible. Love is invisible. War is invisible. Capital is invisible.
the 1950s and 60s, the US Air Force installed grayscales and resolution targets in the California desert to calibrate aerial photographs and videos. Resolution determines visibility. It calibrates the world as a picture.
Okay, so there are many more chapters of this instruction video. But I think it's more or less time to open the show, and I would be happy to take any questions if there are any. Maybe we can have a little light. I think it would be preferable to have a little light in the audience. Okay. Yeah, you are invisible. It's very simple, yeah. Okay, wonderful. Great. So now, well, if there is any... Yes, there's a question. Yeah.
I have a story that brings together the two last videos. I'm interested because it deals with Vancouver, where you are now, and Howard Hughes, late in life, wanted to disappear, and he disappeared to Vancouver and stayed at the top of a hotel not far from the Sylvia, the Bay Shore, as a recluse. And he was escaping from the tax authorities in the US, in other words, trying to escape from one version of capital. And he was escaping also from his fantasies and fears of nuclear war, in other words, explosions. So it seems to me that that's an unintended but very interesting connection for this place between the two videos.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. Hi. Mm-hmm. I have to think about it. I will answer you in a minute. Maybe I will take another question in the meantime. Yes.
I'm wondering about, thank you for your talk. I'm wondering about your process to arriving to this narratives of abstraction, and how much does it matter your input in terms of the fictitious construction of them? But also, I'm wondering about invisibility in terms of maybe political invisibility or minorities' invisibility, and how much can that play into abstraction? Or your thoughts being a visible minority and finding that invisibility, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because I've never linked these two areas. I mean, of course, if you progress further into the work about invisibility, it will become very apparent, what ambivalent state the state of invisibility is. In fact, the video will sort of be located in a 3D animation of a shopping mall, where in my fantasy all the political disappeared of the last 30 years hide out. They have retracted into 3D animations as render ghosts, because they were not only made invisible but physically eliminated and disappeared and erased. So I think that all the render ghosts and maybe all the artifacts that we have within digital animations are sort of the traces of the disappeared and the invisible. That's one thing. But to think about how abstraction, well, I think, this answers the question of how abstraction could play into that, right? And if we think of the artifact, the digital artifact, in its present-day version, it will change, no? But as for now, it presents some form of abstraction within digital representation. If we think of that as a stand-in for the invisible and the disappeared, that might be an interesting... I mean, for me, this would be the kind of fiction I would spin around, these ideas in order to make a connection. And indeed, this is very close to what the work about invisibility ends up doing. Yeah, because the glitch is kind of, is the, how do you call it? The erasure, right? The cancelling out of visual information. But there is not nothing, there is not a void, there is a kind of abstraction instead, as a stand-in, as I said, not as a representation. It's rather a dummy. It's something. It's something else. Yes, Judy.
Okay. I just wondered if you could, it's a simple question, to just say if you could say a little bit more about the frameworks of documentary and essay, and what those, if they continue to bring something to your work, and how they're useful for you, if they are.
Yeah, I mean, yes, yes. I don't know what the documentary is, and I think it's constituted by this zone of not knowing what it is, no? Of the uncertainty. I think it is really, the uncertainty is the base of the documentary, and the anxiety over its truthfulness constitutes what it is about for me, basically. And this continues, of course, to be important nowadays, even though by now audiences, I think, have, they are so much aware of these ongoing anxieties that they've somehow internalized it into their viewing habits, if you like, no? The essay, on the other hand, is equally ambivalent, but from a slightly different perspective, because it has a more, let's say, playful relation to its elements and their relation to reality, let's put it like that. It's not that it's not given, but it can also be questioned or suspended, if you like. But equally, I think that the form of essay is tied to processes of, let's say, contemporary capital accumulation, which works in a very essayistic way by fragmenting processes of modes of production, for example, or locations of production, or people's time, people's working time, leisure time, any kind of time, into small fragments which are sort of randomly recombined. This is also a quite essayistic process. So I think, any of these forms is tied in with contemporary social, political, economical conditions, and I think none of them is able to assume any sort of critical distance. They are all embedded in different ways into the moment we're living.
Hi. Hello. Thanks for your talk. I really appreciated it. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about your aesthetic sensibility, how you make your work. It seems like there's a quality of the amateur in it, a kind of intentional low-res sensibility. And I think about Martha Rosler talking about the aesthetics of the amateur. And I'm just wondering if this is something that you continue to embrace in your work, or if you have anything to say about that kind of sensibility.
Yes. Yes. There's no other position I could, assume. So I have to keep on going, running with this. No, but also, not necessarily the failure, but the misunderstanding or the getting it wrong or the slip, if you like, is much more interesting than any sort of, for me at least, as a procedure, as a thought process, than any sort of expert point of view.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more, even though it's mostly what you've been talking about. If you could talk a little bit more about the idea of abstraction. You bring up how abstraction as a result of capital, and then abstraction as an idea in visual art, and they're both philosophically different problems, and just how it is that you play in between the two.
Could you repeat the last bit of your question? Just the last half sentence.
They're both philosophically different problems, and how it is that you play in between the two different problems.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there's of course many meanings of words which are different, right? Yet it's the same word. But I think that if something is called the same, then there will be some force of similarity, working in between these meanings as counterintuitive and wrong, so to speak, it might be. But it's always worth exploring the what is it? In German it's called Wahlverwandtschaften, the elective affinities, right? Between the different meanings of words which are the same but which have different meanings. And I think it's worth it. So I'm not trying to claim, even though perhaps I am trying to claim that abstraction in the sense of finance and capital, and abstraction as a philosophical idea, and abstraction in representation are related. It's probably what I'm trying to claim without really knowing what I'm doing.
I have a question for you about verticality in your work. Verticality, the vertical.
Uh-huh.
And in this work, in Adorno's Gray, there are these different structural and material vertical elements. So you have the verticals of the screens that lean and sort of fragment each other. And then also there's this quality in the video where you have these sort of gray vertical panels, and this way that the vertical images wipe across each other in the image field. And then also with the columns, the way that the timelines are also identified by the decades, this sort of vertical structure as well in the work. And I know that in your own writing on verticality, you also reference Adorno's thoughts on the vertical, or the vertiginous, I suppose. And I'm just wondering if this is how this maybe works into how to read the work upstairs, or if you were thinking about this like vertical form with the space as well, with the room, the way the room cuts through the space in this kind of vertical form.
I think she's referring to the form of the installation, which you have not seen yet. It's basically a 16:9 screen, which consists of 4 different screens which are sort of angled against one another and which fracture the surface of the screen. So I think only if you start from the idea that a 16:9 screen is something, I don't know, normal or regular, can you deduct or deduce that a portrait screen is vertical, right? I think for me it's less about verticality than about introducing ruptures in the plane of representation. And this also goes for the timelines. You will see there are vinyl timelines which again try to connect things which have absolutely nothing to do with one another, which is the history of the monochrome throughout the 20th century, the history of nude protests during the same area, some trivia again from Adorno's life, and also, unrelated incidents from student protests around the world, and they are sort of arranged in horizontal and vertical lines to form a completely disjointed patchwork, if you want to, or pattern of events which are mainly connected by being completely fragmentary and not being related to one another, right? They are just forced together by their form. And this is not a coincidence, because I really seriously asked historians, is there anything like a history of student protests throughout the 20th century? And it was important for me that this history be global, right? And not restricted to Paris and Berkeley and Frankfurt and whatnot. And there is none. No, I mean, this history cannot be written. It is so complex, right, that the relations between, let's say, movements of decolonization and the civil rights movement and so on, and how they influenced, how they went viral, so to speak, over the world after the 50s, after the 60s, this history has not been written. I mean, it's not impossible, but no one has undertaken this gigantic effort to do it. So that for now, it can only be referred to, and I'm totally certain this exists and that this needs to be written and it needs to be told, this story. How protest branches out over the world and mainly comes from, regions which we consider as peripheries, right? But this history does not exist. It has not been written, and it can only be referred to by form of these fragments, which are in fact arbitrary, which just reference this thing which does not exist, if you like. So for me, it's much more about the fragmentariness of the arrangement than about it being arranged into vertical or horizontal patterns.
I'd like to thank you, Hito, very much for coming.